Good evening. Over the past couple of weeks, while sheltering at home, like many people, I've been looking for ways to pass the time, to occupy my time. Of course, a good bit of time has been spent simply reading and studying the Word of God. There's been a good bit of time as well spent with my family, putting together puzzles, playing games, and just doing things that I generally enjoy doing with my wife and children. But I also have to acknowledge this. There has also been Netflix. Now, in all honesty, much of what is offered on Netflix is of little interest to me, but I do like a good documentary. And if there's one about things of a historical or even religious nature, I'll probably give it a look. And one such series that is currently showing on there that apparently was filmed a few years ago is one that's called The Story of God. It's hosted by Morgan Freeman. I just love hearing him talk. But it's hosted by Morgan Freeman, and he travels around the world pondering certain questions of a religious nature, things that pertain to belief in God, and talks to people about those questions that he has. And in one episode recently, his travels took him to Texas, where he interviewed the pastor of a well-known mega church. I won't mention the pastor's name, but if I did, it would be a name that most of you would probably recognize. And I took note as Mr. Freeman asked this man about the message that he delivers to his congregants, that the man noted that he really makes it a point not to preach about a whole lot of doctrinal stuff. Doctrine is one of those things that can certainly have a divisive impact on people when they discuss religious things. And because of this, there are many preachers who, like the one in Texas, choose just to avoid preaching on the subject of doctrine. I've even heard one such preacher claim that doctrine really isn't all that important. I just can't bring myself to agree with that statement. Of course, first of all, it might be helpful to clarify what it is that I'm talking about when I'm talking about doctrine. In the sense to which I'm referring, Merriam-Webster defines it as something that is taught. And the word that is usually translated as doctrine in the New Testament really has pretty much the same meaning. It has to do with what a person, or in this context, a church, teaches. What it teaches with regard to salvation, with regard to worship, and even with regard to the work that Christians or churches ought to be doing. And based on that, it shouldn't be surprising then to find that doctrine will have an impact on the practices of a church. And the New Testament does not present doctrine as an unimportant thing. In fact, I believe an honest and open-minded reading of the New Testament will reveal this fact, that doctrine matters. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, following the establishment of the church, one of the things that we are told that those earliest converts to Christianity remained steadfast in was the apostles' doctrine. It seems that doctrine was important to those folks. And I would like to point out that what this passage there says is that they remained steadfast in the same doctrine. Luke there records the disciples, those first converts, as remaining steadfast in the apostles', plural, doctrine, singular, meaning that all the apostles were teaching the same doctrine, which is only logical when you think about it, because after all, how many different doctrines did Jesus teach the apostles? I mean, did he teach Matthew one thing, and then Bartholomew another thing, and Peter another thing? No. Jesus taught them all the same thing. He taught them all the same doctrine. And if the apostles were faithful to what Jesus taught them, then they all taught the same doctrine when they went out teaching. Well, Acts chapter 2 and verse 42 indicates that this is what the apostles did. Not only this, but we can also note that they taught this singular doctrine, this one doctrine, wherever they went. I think of Paul's words to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, when he noted that he taught the same things in every church. He didn't teach one thing at Philippi, and another thing at Corinth, and another thing at Ephesus. I've heard it said that the water is purest the closer you get to the source of the spring. And when you go back to the beginning to see how things were when the Lord first established the church, before the onset of all the religious confusion we see in the Christian world, you find that there was but one church, first of all, but you also find that the same doctrine was being taught and practiced wherever members of this one church assembled and worked together. And yes, it was important to do that. It was important to remain within the one doctrine. John, in 2 John verse 9, 2 John only has one chapter, but in 2 John verse 9, the Apostle John wrote that anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. The doctrine of Christ that John refers to there is the same doctrine that is referred to as the Apostles' doctrine in Acts chapter 2. It is simply the doctrine that Jesus gave to the apostles, both through his teaching while here on earth, as well as the guidance he gave them through the Holy Spirit after he left the earth. But the apostles all taught one doctrine. And those who were taught by them, if they continued to remain faithful, they continued to preach that one doctrine as well. But not everyone did. Not everyone continued to teach the same doctrine. And that did matter. We can see that in places like 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 3, where Paul urged Timothy to charge some that they should teach no other doctrine. Other than what? Other than the doctrine of Christ. But by the end of the first century, there were already other erroneous doctrines popping up. Paul said those doctrines should not be taught. Teaching the right thing, the right doctrine, mattered. In fact, speaking of Timothy, Paul wrote 2 letters to this young preacher that are preserved for us in the pages of the New Testament. And he also wrote another letter to another young preacher by the name of Titus. That letter bears Titus' name, and it's right after the letters to Timothy. But you've got these 3 letters written by an apostle to these young preachers to help them as they taught others. And they're fairly short letters, but in these 3 fairly short letters written to help men who would be teaching others, Paul mentions doctrine 15 times by my count. The indication from the New Testament is that the doctrine taught by a church matters. A church, like a Christian, should be teaching the right doctrine, the doctrine that is taught in the pages of the New Testament. I truly believe that if we all limited ourselves to just teaching that doctrine, we would all be teaching the same thing, and there would be a lot less religious confusion in the world. I find it interesting that the word doctrines, plural, that word appears only 3 times in the New Testament. In other words, a multiplicity of doctrines is mentioned only those 3 times in the New Testament. In Colossians chapter 2 and verse 22, in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1, and then in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 9. Those are the only 3 places in the New Testament where you read of doctrines in the plural. And in each of those instances, pluralities of doctrines are spoken of in a negative light. In Colossians chapter 2, Paul writes of religious regulations that some will needlessly subject themselves to, noting that such have not come from God, but from the doctrines of men. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, Paul makes reference to some who would depart from the faith because they give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of demons. And then in Hebrews chapter 13, we're told that we should not be carried about with various and strange doctrines. So again, whenever plural doctrines are mentioned in the New Testament, the writer is warning the reader against such. On the other hand, whenever doctrine is spoken of in a positive light in the New Testament, it's always in the singular. Doctrine matters. That is to say, what is taught matters. It matters to the eternal well-being of the one who is being taught, to be sure, but I tell you what, it also matters to the eternal well-being of the one who is doing the teaching. Let's all look for ourselves to the source of pure doctrine, not some creed book or worship manual, but the New Testament of Jesus Christ. We do that, and we'll be a lot further along our path toward heaven. I hope you have a good day.